Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
It should have been a normal flat fire. It was just an electrical appliance malfunctioning in a flat on the 6th floor of a 1950s council block. The London Fire Brigade attended these sorts of events every day. Often, they put it out without the other residents of the building even knowing. But this fire would be different. The tower block had been poorly maintained, and serious fire safety defects had been allowed to fester. Residents had raised their concerns without any success. A legally required risk assessment had not been carried out. And worse, a recent refurbishment had seen highly combustible panels fixed to the external wall. It was the middle of a hot summer when the fire broke out, the flames licking through an open window, igniting one of the panels. It began to spread up the building, threatening other flats. This took the fire service by surprise. Fire was not supposed to spread from flat to flat. As call after call came in from trapped residents, the call handlers fell on the textbook's advice: stay put. On the ground, the rescue operation became chaotic. This was outside the firefighters' training, and they didn't know how to respond. Outdated equipment hindered the coordination of the response. Command was passed rapidly from one officer to another, and key information necessary to save the trapped residents was not conveyed to the teams on the ground quickly enough. Residents were left waiting desperately for help that would never come. If they'd been told to flee, they would likely have lived. Harrowing 999 calls, which would later be played at a mammoth public inquest, recorded the rising panic of those trapped as smoke filled their burning flats. The fire ripped through the poorly maintained building. Fire doors failed, and eventually, the single staircase filled with pitch dark, choking smoke. In just one bathroom, 2 mothers and their 3 children died, including a baby born just weeks before. The council were aware of our concerns. We told them we needed certain measures put in place, one resident told the Evening Standard just days after the fire. But every time we complained, they told us they'd taken our concerns on board, but nothing ever happened. Questions rapidly emerged about other social housing tower blocks around the country, as it appeared some of the safety issues which had turned this fire into a disaster were widespread. Amid a storm of criticism, the fire service said it would review the stay put advice it had given trapped residents. It was Britain's worst ever tower block fire, and politicians solemnly promised it would never happen again. But these promises would be broken. Because this wasn't the Grenfell Tower fire of 2017. It was a fire at Lakenhall House, a tower block in Southwark, in southeast London, in 2009. 3 adults, 2 children, and 1 20-day-old baby lost their lives in a terrifying, painful, public, and avoidable tragedy. But the bodies of Helen Udoka and her daughter Michelle, Diana, Frances Queen, and her children Ty and Philippe, and Catherine Hickman, were not enough to persuade this country to change course. The fire that killed them demonstrated all the fundamental flaws that would lead to the horrors seen at Grenfell Tower 8 years later. Combustible external panels allowed the blaze to spread out of the flat of origin and climb up the building's exterior. Internal breaches to fire protection allowed smoke and flame to spread through the building, and the fire brigade's blind faith in its advice to stay put resulted in the victims losing their chance to escape. All of this was known well before the flames engulfed Grenfell Tower. We simply chose not to act. Regulations went unamended, and plans to avoid the repeat of the disaster were not made. Warning voices were ignored. It tells us something about how we are governed, and the priority our political and economical system places on human life, especially when those lives are likely to be poor, immigrant, and from ethnic minority backgrounds. Grenfell was a result of a series of choices, the sum of state neglect and corporate wrongdoing across a variety of areas, the epicenter of myriad defects in our social fabric. More than anything, it was a result of political choices. Grenfell as a lens through which to see how we are governed, said Stephanie Barwise QC, a lawyer representing the bereaved and survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire in December 2021. This book will peer through the lens. The picture it unveils should appall us. Over a period of at least 30 years, our representatives chose time and again not to act on mounting evidence that something needed to be done to prevent a disaster in a high-rise building. They deliberately ran down, neglected, and privatized the arms of the state that might have otherwise avoided the need for this book. And they allied themselves with the corporate world that evidence an almost psychopathic disregard for human life. If you think this is hyperbole, consider the following, all of which will be explained in the pages to come. An employee at one insulation manufacturer described a fire test on a system containing its product as a raging inferno in 2007, but buried the testing and marketed it specifically for use on high-rise buildings. When its fire performance was questioned, one manager said those raising the issues could go fuck themselves. Senior figures at a cladding manufacturer exchanged emails internally saying the company was in the know about its product's poor performance, but told its salespeople to keep its true performance very confidential. And one internal document speculates about the commercial consequences of a fire in a tower block clad with this product, killing 60 to 70 persons. Both those materials would end up on Grenfell Tower. Consider a contractor whose staff bragged about being quids in due to the additional profit margin they would gain by switching the cladding on the tower for the cheapest option. Consider another contractor dismissing the need for tough fire breaks by writing, as we all know, the ACM cladding will be gone rather quickly in a fire. Consider the management company that concealed reports of a faulty smoke extraction system and wrote, "Let us hope our luck holds and there isn't a fire." Consider the fire service that fretted about issuing a public warning about the widespread use of combustible cladding in the capital, as that would let the cat out of the bag. Then consider a government whose officials internally laughed off calls for tighter fire safety regulations because of the impact on UK PLC. That had paid for the test on the precise cladding product used on Grenfell Tower in 2001, saw that it failed devastatingly, sending 20-meter high flames ripping through a test rig in just 5 minutes, but did not make a relatively simple tweak to official guidance to force it out of the market. And that wholly failed to implement the simple and clearly expressed recommendations the Lakanal House coroner made to prevent further deaths, with the official's response for doing so writing that the government did not need to kiss her backside. The government was bound to an ideology that said it should not regulate the private sector, but should instead reduce any restrictions to allow it to generate economic growth. In the years before Grenfell, this became all-out assault on regulation codified in a red tape challenge, and a 1-in, 3-out rule, which effectively banned the introduction of any stringent new rules on business. And in the crucial but niche area of fire safety in high-rise buildings, this utterly undermined its ability to ensure the safety of its residents. Throughout, the government relied on the fact that deaths in fires were falling to justify its failure to tighten fire safety rules. This is said to have been expressed by officials with the following phrase: "Show me the bodies." There were simply not enough deaths to justify new restrictions. And on the 14th of June 2017, our government got what it asked for. The Grenfell Tower fire killed 72 people, including 18 children. It ripped families apart and traumatized an entire community, destroyed 129 homes, and caused damage that, for many involved, can never be repaired. It is the most serious crime committed on British soil this century. It is a story about how these failures combined to inflict an appalling disaster on a West London community on the 14th of June 2017. Some families lost 3 generations in one night. Even those who survived the fire will carry the trauma of what they have experienced forever. Today my conversation is with Peter Apps. Peter is the author of Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen, and the origin of which the first part of this podcast comes from. With his permission, I've shared with you the first few pages of what I feel is an incredible book. We're going to put some links in the notes for this podcast. You go and look at the book, grab a hold of it on Audible or Amazon. But in our conversation today, we explore some of the wider context and go into some more detail about some of the areas that were covered. Our hope is to draw attention to, give insights into, and hopefully inspire change. Our sincere hope is that the lessons that were learned for the second time on 14th of June 2017 need not be learnt again.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. So today I'm speaking with Peter Apps, who is an award-winning journalist, deputy editor at Inside Housing and author of Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen. He first broke the story on the dangers of combustible cladding 34 days before Grenfell, and I'm absolutely privileged to have you on, brother. It's a real excitement. I've said before we came on now, I've listened to the book twice, and then you were kind enough to send me a bit of a manifest style thing so I can pull some of the detail out, because there's some super emotive stuff in there. But first of all, thanks for coming on the podcast, brother.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Mate, so obviously we were talking about a super emotive thing today. Lots of people have all their own opinions about it. But what I love for you is that you kind of bring receipts. And what I mean by that is when people go on, and we'll put the notes and links for your book, for the Amazon and the Audible stuff below this, you go into some real genuine detail about the history behind some of the testing, the history in other buildings, other examples around the UK, which kind of frames that, how we let it happen, which sounds like a really, provocative start. But I wanted to perhaps start by giving people some context on your background in journalism, if we can.
Yeah, sure. I started off on the local press, which when I started back in 2011, 2012 was still just about available as a first step onto the ladder. So I did some stuff around sort of North and West London, basically. And then I did a lot of court reporting, which was helpful later on in my career when I was reporting from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. And that will come on to this, I think, but that actually included some of the inquest into the deaths at Lakanal House in 2013. And then I moved to a magazine called Inside Housing, which is a specialist publication. It's not one that you'll come across in day-to-day life very much, but we write for people who work in what you call housing sector, so sort of social landlords, big housing associations, council housing teams, that sort of thing. If you work in that,
it's a heavy lift to read. I went and had a look at it. You've got to know the sector quite well to be able to digest some of that personally.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some big technical stuff in there, but these are people who own and manage houses and high-rise buildings, and as a result, fire safety's always been a part of that story. That's kind of broad topic area we've been writing about.
That must be an absolute minefield for people that are seeking, the true romantic purists of the journalism world, and I'd like to try and include you in that, who really are about trying to convey the truth, convey what's being said, what they've heard. But this is, and again, the book does a wonderful example of showing it, this a big pressure political environment, some of this stuff, because there's big monies, there's big chess pieces moving in these sort of spheres.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think fire safety is a really difficult area because there's a lot of interest at stake. There's both organizations that try and make money out of it by promoting solutions and saying, hey, we should all use my product and then buildings are safe. And there's also people whose interest can be threatened by fire safety. So if you change regulations to say you can't build in this way or you can't use this product, then companies feel that immediately in their bottom line. And so I think there's a lot of dishonesty in fire safety, and it's very hard sometimes, even for experts, and I don't count myself as an expert, but even for experts to pick their way through who they can trust and who they can't.
Yeah. I think the point you make there, and it's a great aspect that I saw coming through in the book, sometimes we assume all these people, and this is my words, not yours, but we say, they're all horrible, they're all... And some people have this thing where they blame the politics and they think anyone with money is evil. and they assume everyone's got bad motives. And I'm like, but probably not. Someone's got introduced to something, they've seen one data set, they've tried to look behind the curtain, find out a bit more, then they've gone elbow deep in it, promoted a product, and then realized, oh shit, it's not what I thought it was. And then you're trying to backpedal your way out of it. Or some people just then hit the accelerator and go, try and mask this as much and punch it through the void. We just need to get it on the books. And there's a little bit of that we'll go into. But I know we're on a time cap today, so I want to be respectful of your time. So what I want to start with, if we can, is the impossible, which is we're going to try and draw some of the key things that I found most interesting about the book. But again, I would strongly encourage anybody to just go and look yourself, because I am going to fumble my way through this from some of the things that really struck out to me. Now, some of the stuff, especially the introduction, which people will have heard me read prior to this, give us some background on the Lakanal House, the Shirley Towers, the Merseyside, because I love the way that you introduce the book. It's a wonderful kind of gotcha for people, and we won't give it away, but like the way you hit that, I was like so deep into my mind had painted the picture of what was happening in London, in Grenfell, and I've read, and I know people that went, and I've had people on that went. So my head was already there, even though I know so much about it, but the stark realization, which is a great introduction of how we let it happen. So whilst I waffle my way through that, give people a little bit of an insight into what we're talking about in the first few chapters.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the most important things I've wanted to communicate, not just with the book, but in all the journalism I've done since the fire, is one message, which is this didn't have to happen. We had warnings. We had, and not just small warnings. Anybody who knows about Lakanal House knows that was a major incident in the UK fire sector, in the UK housing industry. 6 people dead, 3 of them children. And that should have been a moment when those lessons were taken on and learned. And there are so many more of those instances. We chose, and I say we, but people in positions of authority in industry and in government chose not to learn those lessons, and then we got the disaster that was, in the end, foreseeable as a result of all of those warnings. Once you put them all together, and so that is just something that even if people just pick up that book in a bookshop and just read the first couple of pages, put it down again, and then walk away, they still get that you didn't. You have
that old shit moment
where
you hit that. I think it's page 8 or page 9 where I'm like, shit. Because honestly, mate, and this is a great point, like there's so many people retiring in the UK Fire and Rescue Service now that genuinely, as much as you say everyone knows, mate, there's a lot of people, even in the London Fire Brigade, don't know about it, because you've got to go and do the dig. You've got to get the debrief and people to find out about it. And it's not that people don't care, but like I said to you before, like firefighters are so busy and all this sort of shit. But the people that do know, with the greatest respect, are often those in these housing industries. And it's like, it was scary to read that.
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's one of the questions that I think firefighters should have from Grenfell is, why weren't we told? Why didn't we know? Why weren't people? Because they, firefighters are the ones who are going to have to go and put these fires out. Fundamentally, they're the ones who are going to have to walk into these burning buildings. Why were we not told about these risks? If I was in your industry, I would be absolutely furious about that. But I'd also want to know, what other risks are we not being told about? What things are being kept?
It's such a quagmire, brother. Like because the stock response will be, well, it's on our internal sites, and if you dig deep enough, you will find the reports and the things. But it's not mandatory that you go and read them. And this is what frustrates me so much. And also, we are, as much as people think the Fire and Rescue Service is the tip of the sword and we must know everything about everything, we're very much just an active participant in this whole thing. And you'll know far better than me, so please elaborate when we come to it. We can advise and we can try and enforce and we can put pressure on things, but we're a very small fish, I think. And that sounds like me trying to slope your shoulder the responsibility, which is not the case at all. But we're not the decision makers in what does or doesn't get done. We can threaten and try and coerce.
A good way of illustrating that is, over the last few years, the London Fire Brigade has been intervening in the planning permission process, asking for second staircases in all of the high-rise building projects, pretty much, that go through the planning portal in London. They get ignored every single time. So no, they don't.
It's only 2 countries, isn't it? Please expand on that bit, because that bit blew my mind. Even all the research I've done.
Yeah. So the research has been, since I wrote the book, the research has been updated. So there's 3 countries in the world where we don't have mandatory second staircases at any height. One of them is England, the other one's South Korea, the other one's Switzerland. In other parts of the world, that requirement comes in from 4 stories. In Ireland, it comes in from 4
Mate,
stories.
people don't know that. I
Now,
promise you.
we are
That's
changing
scary.
that. Supposedly in England, we are changing that. We are gonna, but we're 6 years on from Grenfell before we're changing that, and the process of changing it is being met with so much resistance. But I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, but how do you evacuate a building and fight a fire when you've got one staircase? You need 2 environments for that. One where you can open the door to the fire flat and fight the fire, and the other one where you can let people come down without getting a lung full of smoke.
Yeah, we can do our best, pressurized staircases, smoke curtains, blah, blah, blah. But we really do need to have one of them staircases predominantly for firefighting actions and transport and all that sort of jazz. But you're right, the colossal cost in putting another staircase, the loss of site you can sell, rent out for flats and all this jazz. But that genuinely will blow people's minds, I think, that we don't have to have 2 staircases.
The thing is with the cost, builders in France and Ireland are still making profit. If they're putting their second staircases in and they're still making profit. So there is a way
Not
to
as
do it.
much.
It's just a question of
argument.
not as much, yeah, but it's just eating a percentage of your bottom line. It's not killing you.
And it's a coward's thing that we offer it as an option. That's my frustration. It's like, well, we strongly suggest. Strongly suggest means don't fucking bother. Is what strongly suggest means.
Well, I mean, and that is the regulations. The way the government sees the regulations is that they're a kind of minimum baseline, and the market will force people to take higher standards because they care about, being the best. And in reality, everyone hits the minimum line, and sometimes they go a little bit below it because that's the cheapest way of doing things. And that's unfortunately, second staircase is a good example of that. You can choose to put a second staircase in if you think it's necessary. Absolutely no one does.
So the aspect around Lacknell House and Shirley Towers was, to come on to another aspect of public and firefighter safety, this aspect of sprinkler system installations. Obviously, that's been strongly endorsed by lots of members in this landscape, but that was originally, or it had another nail stuck in the coffin of it. I think it was disregarded by Sir Ken Knight through some of your research again, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So we had the Shirley Towers fire in Southampton where 2 firefighters tragically lost their lives. And then we had, I think a year before that, actually, we'd had the Lacknell House fire. As I mentioned, we lost six people. And so you had the kind of investigations into those fires coming at around about the same time. And what both of them said was, look, we built a lot of social housing in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Those buildings are getting older now. They're less reliable. It's harder to rely on the fire safety features of those buildings. Exactly. So you build a building out of concrete, it has 2 hours fire resistance, and therefore you think that stay put is a reasonable strategy. But over the 30, 40, 50 years, who's to say a plumber, an electrician, someone fitting television cables or broadband internet hasn't? I think in Lacknell House, it's suspended ceilings. They cut straight through the fire protection. And so what the sort of view was after those fires is, we can't be absolutely confident anymore that these buildings are safe. We can't be absolutely confident. So what we need is some sort of backup in case they're not. Exactly. And the most obvious way to do that, and actually the cheapest way to do that, is to get fire suppression into those buildings. Just think about firefighting a fire in a high-rise building. You've got to get access, probably means you need a key fob. You've then got to get up to the 17th, 18th floor, wherever that fire's going. You've got to break the door down. All that time before you get water onto the fire. If you've got a sprinkler system in that flat, you get water on the fire in minutes. And that means it's going to be far less out of control by the time the firefighters are 10. The logic of that is supported by sort of the insurance industry because it would reduce losses. It's supported by the higher levels of the firefighting establishment, and it's supported by a lot of kind of independent experts as well. The problem is it costs money. If you say to local authorities who own that, you need to retrofit these into your stock, you're going to have to provide money for them to do it. And we were at a position, if you think about when the Lacknell House inquest was, it's 2013. Shirley Towers inquest was a year before that, I think. We were in this austerity era when £1 billion, which is about the estimate for what that would have cost, was just money the government didn't want to spend. And so
That's the thing I say that I didn't want to spend, because with all due respect, like when you start spending fucking billions to all these different countries and Ukraine, and I'm not saying the motives, I'm not going down them rabbit holes, I'm sure it was all justified, but it's not that we don't have money, it's just whether or not we think the juice is worth the squeeze.
Yeah, I mean, look, £1 billion sounds like a lot of money to you and me, but in the context of government spending, it's not that much. 72 billion on HS2 that's the topic at the moment, and so the government is able to make these investments when it wants to. I think that but yes, there was this report from Sir Ken Knight which came in, which said it's not. He had some calculation which said that the amount that you save from fire losses versus the amount it costs to install for sprinklers, the sums don't add up. We shouldn't do it. Then what happened is the numbers actually changed. It got a lot cheaper to install sprinklers. And so campaigning organisations would say, well, Ken Knight needs to go back and do his sums again because the maths have changed. And they absolutely refused to do that because they knew that then the maths would work out in favour of installing sprinklers and their argument against it would be lost. But,
even the initial sums, with all due respect, they're basing them on a perfect world. Whereas, like you say, when you go and check the building out, I forget how many, as an example, soft closers weren't working, how many. So the data that you're assuming, the assumed safety of this building already is what you're doing your calculation on, which on, credit of the investigations wasn't the case anyway. So it's almost like you're building your house on sand.
Completely. I mean, and we've seen this post Grenfell. I don't think there's a single high-rise building in the country that has no safety issues with it. Even the sort of luxury end of the market, it has construction issues, it has maintenance issues. These are complex structures that it doesn't take an awful lot. The smoke ventilation's broken. Yeah, that can happen. You have to legislate for that and expect it.
When they went to them places, and I forget the guy he dropped a piece of paper down one of the walls and it went down several floors, and they pumped a bit of smoke in and it's coming out 6 floors above. Synthetic smoke. You're like, shit, the bed. That's got to be concerning when you're a resident and you go, is that okay or not? And they just go quiet and they're like, look, don't worry about it.
Anyone who lives in a high-rise building in social housing will tell you the truth about how these buildings are maintained and how they've been maintained across the last 30 or 40 years. If they're not being looked after for issues like damp and mold, for issues like soundproofing, for just keeping them neat and tidy and comfortable as places to live, they're not being looked after for fire safety either. And that's the fundamental reality. But we still rely, like you say, on this idea of perfect buildings and the idea that they all have 2-hour fire resistance. And we base our fire strategies on that. And we ask firefighters to fight fires under that assumption and don't give them a plan B for if it doesn't work. Another point I'd make on that, which I think is
the thing where we do need to take a bit of ownership from that whole, we'll get onto that in a bit. Sorry for interrupting. Carry on.
Yeah, that's all right. No, but another point I make on that is it gets very kind of pounds and pence, these sorts of analysis. There's a bit in the book where we talk about they say the cost to industry of a certain regulation would be £2 million a year, and then the cost in terms of life saved, because an actuarial calculation puts the value of a life at about 60 grand. Right. And so you add the two up and you say, well, the cost to an industry is higher. But that £60,000 is a human life. That's somebody's child, somebody's grandmother, somebody's, mum or dad or uncle or aunt. And 60 grand, how can you make these decisions where a child's life is given a financial value and weighed as less important than a cost to industry? But that is how it's not conspiracy. That is literally
that's been happening for years. The insurance the insurance is built on that. The whole sector is built on that.
Exactly.
There has to be a metric.
It's again, like you say, it's worth exploring when people say, well, we can't afford this. Their sums will have placed a value on human life that you and I probably would not agree with.
I know. And other people will disagree with that, but it's a very emotive thing. I want to take you on to the turning the ugly into pretty. So the conversation around ACM, and I know again I'm going to ask for the impossible of trying to draw some insights for people from, and there's some fascinating chapters on this. Some of the testing, take us to the testing in July 2001. So give people a bit of an understanding of when we knew something was, or the people doing them rigs.
I think maybe just for your listeners who might be kind of newer to this topic, I'll just briefly explain what ACM is. So it's a material made of a tiny sheet of aluminium, two tiny slivers of aluminium, which are then bonded together with plastic. So it's like a sandwich. It's a composite product. And that makes it a bit cheaper to make than just solid aluminium. It also makes it kind of more rigid and easier to work. So it's a useful building material if you're trying to cut out complicated shapes and fit it to the outside of a building. The problem you've got there is that the plastic that you use in the middle to bond those two bits of aluminium together is something called polyethylene. Now, without going back to your GCSE chemistry, polyethylene is effectively petrol in its solid form. It's chemically the
The
same.
ethylene gives a bit of a giveaway for
Right.
people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Ethylene, ethanol, So right. So
Yeah.
this is solid petrol. And if you ignite it, it's going to burn like solid petrol. And if you stack all of those things up vertically so that you've got a line of solid petrol running up to the top of a building, and then you start a fire at the bottom, you've got a very big problem very quickly. Because not only is that fire going to shoot up, the petrol, the plastic is going to melt and drip and start other fires elsewhere and start spreading around the building. So when did we first find out about this risk? Well, we started cladding buildings in sort of the 1990s. We had a couple of fires, one in Merseyside, one in Irving in Scotland. And the government started exploring the risk. And what they did was they got some cladding products that were popular use, wide use on the market. They took them to a testing rig run by the Building Research Establishment, and they set them on fire to see what happened. It was a 9-meter testing rig. They built a mock wall similar to one that would be used in the real world, started a fire in a crib at the base of it, and then observed for 30 minutes to see how safe this was. When they used the ACM, 9-meter rig, 30-minute test, within 6 minutes, the flames were spreading 20 meters above the top of the 9-meter rig, and they had to halt that experiment because otherwise it would have burnt the laboratory down. So, and that's in 2001, right? That report then goes to government and it says this stuff is on the market. Not only is it on the market, because it has that non-combustible surface, the aluminium on the surface, it's actually legal. Your guidance doesn't ban this stuff. And so you leave government thinking, oh, maybe we should stop this being put on the outside of people's homes, given what we've just learned. But then you see pressure from industry saying, if you introduce tighter rules, it's going to have consequences for sales, for the economy, for this growing movement to reclad high-rise buildings. And so nothing happens. That report is never released by government. Even after the Grenfell Tower fire, it took until the inquiry forced that out in, I think, 2021. So 4 years after the Grenfell Tower fire, when we were all trying to work out what was going wrong, they had that paper. And so, you take that. And I mean, for me, there's lots of moments in this story when this whole thing could have been avoided, right? But 2001, before really, you maybe had less than 100, if that, buildings with this material on around the UK. At that point, you could have said, no, that's not going on any other buildings. We're going to find out where it is and take it off. And the problem is literally snuffed out at that moment. And there was an active decision not to do that.
I think for a lot of this stuff, it ends up getting stuck in consult. And you see a few references through the book where someone will make an objection and something will ask to be reassessed. And then it just gets stuck in a 9-month quagmire and nothing comes back. There's several references you give where you've found an email or through, freedom of request, you've got access to some information that just never gets responded to. So there has been, and it's important for us to say this, from the sector, there has been a number of individuals tried to raise the flag and go, oh, I'm really not sure about this. Can someone help me understand? I'm hoping this isn't the case. And they've either been ignored, they've been strongly discouraged, or there's actually some pretty, like we talk about the fire and rescue service being in a bad cultural place. There was some pretty strong wordings in some of them. And then when people were questioned in the inquiries were like, oh no, my missus was poorly, so I was in a bad mood, or just some bullshit where it was serious fucking bigotry and just sexist behavior. Some of the stuff that you hear in the emails and the disregarding of people giving advice. There was one particular male, and we won't try and remember his name in this, but just said something funny to me at the time, which shouldn't be funny, but fairly unreal when some of these individuals giving feedback about the changes that need to be made in some of these buildings.
I was just, are you thinking of the gentleman who said they can go fuck themselves, and if they
Yes.
try and do anything, we'll sue their arse off. We'll sue the arse off them.
Yeah, that one. Yeah,
Yeah,
and he was like, was this what you?" I think he put that in a fucking email, didn't he, or
yeah,
some
he
shit
did.
like
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
I was
yeah,
like,
an email. Yeah,
what
yeah.
the
He's
fuck?
struggling. Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah,
yeah, and that's just obviously maybe they would say the level of trust that belongs in that culture, but just the level of audacious. I don't give a fuck. I am doing what I want to do. This is my business. You know, the amount of good people I've got in my back pocket who can pull out some data to tell you your stuff is BS and just silence people that are trying to raise some of these stuff. And when we talk about silencing, it might be a good opportunity. You reference a gentleman, Ronnie King,
yeah.
who had tried, and I'm sure he's not perfect as well, but he was a real advocate for trying to get a lot of these changes through the system. What were your interactions with him?
So Ronnie's a retired firefighter.
Yes, yeah.
He's pushed the cause of sprinklers quite hard down the years. He worked with a gentleman called Sam Webb, who's an architect who sadly passed away last year. But Sam Webb had been campaigning for safer high-rise buildings since the Ronan Point collapse in Newham in 1968. So Sam goes right back, and Sam has just always been a problem for people who want to get away with shortcuts and things that aren't that safe. And so Ronnie and Sam worked in Parliament, actually with the MP the MP David Amess, the guy who was actually murdered very sadly not too long ago, to raise these concerns with the department. And they sent these letters over and over again throughout, after the Lacknell House inquest and before Grenfell. They continually raised this issue. Look, we are sticking combustible materials to the outside of our buildings. They don't have sprinklers. We're going to tell people to stay put in a fire. Something could go wrong. And they were just constantly rebuffed. That people didn't want to have a meeting with them. When they did have a meeting with them, they sort of laughed at them behind the scenes, and they took nothing that they said seriously. And you know, I think certainly Sam, when I spoke to him afterwards, and I think Ronnie as well, really feel that. I think when they saw what happened at Grenfell, they woke up at 4 a.m., saw it on the television, and this was what they knew could happen. They knew, and the reason they've been pushing so hard is because they knew something like this was coming. And that's why, even when they were ignored by the kind of fifth minister in succession, they carried on badgering them. So, yeah, there are people in this story like that. There are diligent people who try, and keep getting knocked back, but keep going. And I've met a lot of people like that, and it gives me some, comfort that it is possible to kind
Thankless
of,
task though sometimes.
yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
a lot of them end up just being martyrs, and it's
Yeah,
so sad. And I'm not trying to discourage anybody from being that passionate, advocate for doing the right thing. But you just looks like they're screaming into the void
I mean, I
sometimes.
remember a guy from the Fire Brigades Union who sat on the Building Regulations Advisory Committee in government for something like 10 years. And then he said he just got to the end of his career. He said he just went home and just shredded every piece of notes he had and said, right, I'm retiring. I'm not going to try anymore because nobody wants to listen and nobody cares. And that is how people end up feeling. But I think, you do see the impact that these people have, though, by causing a nuisance and by making people ask difficult questions. I think we'd be in a worse place without them, even though we're still in quite a bad place. There's a small sort of positive I can take from that.
One of the things that I remember reading about the cladding company, especially, because the ACM stuff did get sort of found out and some heavy pushback, and then they ended up testing a similar product, and through a method of creative sales technique, the ratings of the panels kind of got tweaked a little bit. I think it was a Mr. Werner, Arcanox Cladding, I think it was. He refused to attend anyway. I think he ended up sending a lady, which was really harsh because she seemed quite out of her depth. This guy just refused to attend. So that the creative aspect and the way, and this is like, I don't even know what professional recourse they would get or legal recourse they would get on something like this, but the way in which they manipulated the rating of the panel to still get it over the line. If you could give an insight into that.
Absolutely. So the company you're talking about is called Arconic. And so let's just put this in context. So we talked about the architects, fire engineers just a moment ago. they almost certainly didn't know at the time that they were refurbed. They made a lot of mistakes. They took a lot of shortcuts, but they didn't know the material they were using was as dangerous as it was. Right? That is fair enough to say that. Arconic, on the other hand, and now this is a big multinational company. They're spun out of a company called Alcoa, which is originally the Aluminium Company of America. You'll never have heard of these guys, but you'll be using their products every time you take a swig from a can of Coke or step in your car. Like they sell aluminium all around the world. Their French arm, Arconic, they start testing their product to new European standards in 2004. And again, to take a complicated issue and simplify it, there's two ways to stick this cladding to the outside of a building. One is for it to be a perfectly flat sheet and bang it onto the building with rivets. The other way is to sort of bend it over into an L shape and hang it on a rail so that it sits on the outside of the building without any nails on the outside, right? They do two tests, one on the flat sheet stuck up with rivets and one on the one that's been bent over. The one with the rivets does okay. It doesn't do brilliantly, but it does okay. The one that's bent over, they suddenly discover that all of that polyethylene pools in the bend, heats up and ignites, and you get a fire that's, I think, 12 times as hot, releases 5 times as much smoke, burns 7 times as fast. It fails even the basement bottom. It cannot get any sort of fire grading. You couldn't put this on a dog kennel, basically. But what they do is, well, we have a pass for this product based on the flat sheet, so let's just disregard that second test and use the testing on the flat sheet to continue to keep this product on the market. And that is widely and openly discussed at a senior level inside Arconic. They say things like, we are in the know, quote unquote, and we need to keep this very confidential. They talk about other fire disasters with ACM cladding around the world and discuss, well, maybe we shouldn't be selling this anymore, but keep it on the market. At one point, they say, we're probably going to have to stop selling this around Europe, but we can still work in jurisdictions where regulations aren't as restrictive, meaning the UK. At one point, and I think this is one of the most shocking documents in the whole inquiry, in 2007, one of their salespeople writes a sort of an options document which considers the implications for them commercially of a fire in a building involving their product killing 70 to 80 people. Now, that's 10 years before Grenfell, and the death count at Grenfell is 72. So they predict almost exactly what happens at Grenfell 10 years earlier.
It's worryingly accurate, isn't it?
Yeah, and they keep this product. They said the panels for Grenfell were sold in 2015. They were sold 8 years after that document was produced. And they are attached to the building in the cassette form, the bent form that I described earlier, based on a certificate where the fire standard is for the rivet flat sheet form, but the certificate makes no distinction between.
You make the statement vague enough, it's actually accurate, isn't it? It's like saying, well, we tested this exact product on a rig and it passed, which is true.
Yeah,
but not in the.
But they just don't tell you the second bit, which is when we bend it over and stick it on rails, it becomes this devastatingly dangerous fire hazard. And they know that, and they not only do they test it in 2004, they do repeat tests throughout the 2010s and keep getting the same result. But they don't tell the industry that, don't tell their clients that. They just keep selling it. And their lawyers say in the inquiry, well, we just sold the flat sheet. It was up to them to bend it and fix it. We didn't do any of that, so it's not our responsibility. But yeah, that's the kind of there's the sort of the construction site stuff where people cut costs and weren't necessarily qualified to do what they were doing, and that's all really bad. And then there's this kind of slightly darker story, really, where people do seem to have known that this stuff was as dangerous as it proved to be, but sold it anyway. And that evidence I find just a bit mind-boggling, really, because I think you were saying earlier, a lot of the time these are kind of good people who get kind of pulled down into a bit of a rabbit hole. And I think that's true a lot of the time. But then you look at some of these documents and you say, well, really? How could you go home and sleep at night knowing that you were sticking to this stuff to the outside of building?
I think, and this will be a very, very strong reach, but people can call bullshit if they want to. But it's like if you ever read some of the old Mein Kampf documents and stuff like that. This is for people that aren't familiar with the German camps. When the old statement was, we're only following orders. And you think how people could do such incredibly
blatant acts of, in those days, obviously, terror and harm and torture to people. And I know this isn't the same, but it's like when you're in the know of something and you go, how can you do that? And I'm only following orders. It's
I
not so
think
much,
there
it's my
is
job.
there's
You know what I
something in that.
mean?
It's
I didn't make this
yeah.
decision. I'm just doing my job.
Well, that's it. It's the only people. What people do is when they see themselves as an individual, they behave in one way with a moral compass. And sometimes when people get behind of a computer and they are now no longer an individual, they're just a servant of the corporation they work for. They are able to turn their kind of moral compass off and do things that I
It's the
think they wouldn't.
dissipation of responsibility,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it is. And you know, I think you're right to say almost all of the most evil things human beings have done throughout history have an element of that about it. Once we take away our own individual morality, suddenly we do things like the slave trade and the Holocaust because you suddenly don't feel anymore like you can do what you want. You're just acting for a bigger authority.
You also see it on the flip side when a horrific act is happening in front of you and everyone assumes someone's calling 999.
Yeah.
Everyone assumes someone else, and everyone else just stood there recording it on their phone.
Yeah.
No one's actually doing anything because everyone thinks it's someone else's job to push back,
you know,
to challenge, to whatever.
There's that attitude in this story as well. I mean, like everybody who was involved in refurbishing the building was asked at some point why they didn't do more to ask questions about whether or not what they were doing was safe. And I think invariably their answer was, well, we thought somebody else was doing that.
Yeah, it was the worst kept secret. It was discussed so openly, we assumed someone was doing something about it.
Yeah.
Now, I know a lot of the stuff we've been going into there is very technical and very heavy for some people, but there is, and one of the things that I think is so beautifully written about this book is the overlap of the debrief timeline, the technical complexities, the legislative decisions of that longer timeline from a holistic point of the building. But then also it goes into some really beautifully and hard-hitting granular detail of some of the individuals, residents, occupants, members of the community that were affected by this. And one of the biggest things for me in it, and total transparency, I had to stop when I was walking my dog when I had this one. It was chapter 13, and I've got kids, and it was the dad with the pregnant wife and his daughters, and the decision to evacuate and the decision to try and get out, and him losing his children on the way. And again, it's one of many incredible stories within it. And this must have been one of the hardest parts to be able to share through the book, but something that really brings it back to the reality of the stories of these people. And I don't know, it's horrible to say which one was your favorite, but like you must have heard so many emotive stories, many of which perhaps you couldn't even share within the book. But give some people, I mean, do you remember that one? Because it was chapter 13. I forget the gentleman's name.
The guy's called Marcio Gomez. I've met him and spoken to him several times, and he's a lovely guy. You know, he's a lovely guy. You meet him on the street. He's a good guy and a good father, and he's just like all the rest of us with children, and he wants to do the best for them. And he was put in this position that is unthinkable, where he faces the choice between staying in his flat and potentially, well, certainly dying in a fire and seeing his children die in a fire, or taking them out onto the 19th floor into pitch black smoke with no real confidence that they were all going to get down alive. And he had to just make that decision in the end.
It's the way it happens though, mate. I think they put the towels over their heads and wet them, and then he kind of doesn't push them, but he has to push the kids through the door, and he's just shouting at them to keep going, but they can't hold on to the railing because it's too hot, so they're just descending, and then they're shouting, and then he can't hear them anymore because he's at the back trying to, and then he hears one of his daughters behind him, and he doesn't know how she's got there, and he's trying to go back up, and he's trying to find them, and then he runs into firefighters, and they force him down, and he's just asking God to take his life instead of the girls. And this is actually, to give the ghost away, you know, this is one of the better stories. Not better, sounds harsh, but like it's one of the happier ending stories. I think so much of those stories will get lost for a lot of people though until they read your book, because with the greatest respect, the inquiry stuff is so heavy and it's so you can't really go through to the bits that you want to hear. You just end up getting stuck in the quagmire of very, very long. And that's why I love something like this. And I really appreciate your time, because it makes it digestible. people can pull the salient points from it, and it's not disaster porn. It's trying to bring people's attention to these really, because I've had it, mate, where I've been stuck in a scurry or I've been in the London Underground and something's happened. My daughter's screaming, and you're grabbing them and you're trying to keep them close to you and just get to somewhere safe so they don't get crushed or pushed onto the tracks or something like this. And you can't imagine what that's like, 10x'd into a situation like this. It's just harrowing. And obviously so many people that chose to go higher, I think everybody on the higher floors unfortunately didn't make it. And again, people can go and read and hear some of those stories and the logic that led them to what, to us, and we're all experts in hindsight, connecting the dots backwards, but would have felt like an illogical decision. Which I suppose brings us on to this aspect of stay put and personal evacuation plans, because that was a real, the disabled residents. And I think I forget the way the gentleman, I think it was a woman actually, sorry, termed it, one of the most surprising acts of open, disrespect of equality in terms of legislation for personal evacuation plans. But from what you learned, and obviously I'm listening from the other side of the coin here, we had such a blind faith in compartmentation, the negating the effects of Coanda effect and vertical spread and surface friction and the likelihood of this stuff happening. It was almost, we didn't have an alternative to stay put.
There should have been a plan made before this incident for what to do if a fire got out of control in a high-rise building, because that risk was known and it had happened before. And I think one of the striking things for me in terms of, where we went wrong is that the London Fire Brigade's fire safety team were presenting to conferences on high-rise fire safety about the risk of cladding fires, but their front line were not being trained on what to do in order to respond to a cladding fire. Now, how has that gone wrong within that institution that you have enough knowledge to go and put a slide deck together and turn up at a conference and say, here's exactly how cladding fires work, here's how they can compromise stay put, here's how they can spread quickly from one floor to another. But the other part of your organization that might actually have to deal with one of these fires is getting nothing other than you just rely on stay put. And in the end, the guy who reversed the stay put on the incident ground was Andy Rowe. And he did it at 2:35 a.m. The control room, and this is just, this is, again, like you say, this is just documenting, but this is just, I think this is just, it's such a tragic point, but it's one that people don't know, is that in the control room, obviously the calls were coming in, an insane volume of calls was coming in, an unmanageable volume of calls. They were in Stratford in their temporary premises, normally based in Merton. They were in Stratford that night. They had a plasma screen TV that would normally show rolling sky footage and can be plugged into the Met Police's telly camera. That plasma screen TV was not working. There was a second television screen which nobody turned on. So no one in that incident room had seen an image of Grenfell Tower on fire. They were probably some of the only people awake at that point in the world that hadn't seen it, because everyone who had access to a smartphone or a television screen had seen that news footage. All they had on the screens in front of them was an information saying fire on a fourth floor kitchen, half of the kitchen alight. And they knew that 50, 60 pumps had been deployed, so they knew it was a big incident, but they didn't know until somebody went downstairs at around 2:30 in the morning, and in his witness statement, he said, "Oh my God, we've been telling people to stay put." Now, what you have there is the incident ground knew that people on the upper floors were being impacted by fire the control room knew that people in the upper floors were being impacted by fire because they were taking the calls from them saying, my living room's on fire. My child's inhaling smoke. They knew that. But they didn't know there was this fire going up the outside of the building. People on the incident ground say that they saw the fire going up the outside of the building, but they didn't realize how many people were being impacted inside. And then, this information is not new, but then the process by which you record who's trapped and where, that in the end got formalized into a sort of grid system, but at times you were relying on people scrawling something onto a whiteboard and then passing that information onto a piece of paper, and someone leaning on the bonnet of a car with bits of burning cladding raining down around him saying there's a family of 5 in flat 17, go and get them, and then trying to run that into the building, and then they write it on the wall on the bridgehead where they kind of have to move the bridgehead up and down because the fire's progressing. The radios aren't working, just like they didn't at Lakanal House, because inside a big concrete building, the radios are basically useless. And we have this incident falling apart. And I think that's tragic, and it has really tragic consequences. But what's all the more tragic about that is that was foreseen at Lakanal House, because the response at Lakanal House fell apart in almost exactly the same way for exactly the same reasons.
The comms on site, the ability to align the fire survival guidance with the reality of the incident commander's intention on the scene. And a lot of stuff has come out since this about how we record and share the fire survival guidance given, the locations of individuals still trapped. And also there's a dedicated officer now at a lot of these scenes that interacts directly with the control center just to triangulate that information. But again, I'm almost sound as though I'm defending and applauding that. Some of this was known years prior, but just didn't make it through to completion in some of the changes that needed to be made.
Before Grenfell, the government and the senior levels of the fire brigade, to be fair, were never willing to engage with that question. They were never willing to accept that it might be a problem. And all they would say is, we rely on stay put. There's no need for a plan B. And so we reached this position where it got to the night of the Grenfell Tower fire. You had dozens of people in that building who had really serious issues, disability issues, vulnerabilities that would make it hard for them to escape. And we had no information about where they were, no plan to get them out, no support for the firefighters to do it, no means for the residents, the loved ones who lived with them, to help them out of the building. You just had a block full of people with vulnerabilities who were now just expected to survive a fire they couldn't escape from. And it was described in the inquiry as a landmark act of discrimination against the disabled and vulnerable, because people with disabilities, pre-existing disabilities, were twice as likely to die in that fire. Families stayed with them. So family members died too, because they were never going to leave their disabled relative. And what's really, really tragic now is we've gone past that fire. We went into the first phase of the inquiry, and the inquiry recommended PEEPs. And the government said immediately, we will adopt every recommendation of the inquiry. What it meant was, we will adopt every recommendation of the inquiry apart from that one, because it first kicked PEEPs into the long grass. And then back in 2022, the Home Office decided that they were not going to move forward with that at all. Instead, what they're going to do is have, if we know that the building's unsafe, if we know it's got dangerous cladding, there's going to be something called a EEIS, which basically means the firefighters will get a database of who needs rescuing, and they'll be told to go and figure it out on the day. In buildings where we don't know that there's an issue, it's just going to be relying on stay put. Now, what I would say about PEEPs, as I said at the start, this is a difficult problem. There's no perfect solutions. There are people for whom it's very hard. They won't want to move house, and it's very, very difficult to see how you would get them out in an incident. But there are people for whom that's not true. There are people for whom a PEEP could be quite a straightforward intervention, just like a second stair rail, low pressure door handle for someone with, or just a really clear plan for someone who's blind or autistic about how they escape. And so if you were to at least try and go for a best endeavours approach, a sort of reasonable efforts to work this problem out approach, you would at least reach a position where there's just a few people who reasonable efforts, best endeavours have not worked, and the fire brigade can rescue them. But currently what we're doing is just putting our head in the sand, assuming this will never happen again, and then asking the firefighters who will turn up in the middle of an incident to solve the problem that all of the experts advising government have not yet been able to solve. And that's unfair to firefighters, and it's unfair to disabled people as far as I'm concerned.
100%, mate. It's for them, it's for the government, it's a very high effort, low reward thing that I think they see it as, and they're like, it's a small minority, it's their problem, they've decided to live there. Look, I know we're tight on time, but I wanted to just give some people some context that have been listening here. So the reason we decided and agreed to come on and have a conversation was a big driver for you as you learned more and more about these incidents and learned a little bit about the fire and rescue service. You've shared with me through many messages the sincere acknowledgement of the efforts of people on the incident ground. So I did want to give you an opportunity to relay that now as we converse, because a lot of the individuals who were asked to respond to this incident really were set up to fail. Only really now we see the full extent of that through the work that you've done.
Yeah, look, I mean, I really want that to come across because, you know, I've read hundreds of witness statements from firefighters who were there. I've met a fair few of them as well and spoken to them, and there were things missing and things that went wrong in the incident response, and everyone accepts that
Yes,
now.
we're not perfect.
What didn't go wrong? What didn't go wrong was the attitude and the desire for people to put their own lives at risk trying to save others, and that was something which was done at huge personal cost and at huge personal risk. You know, people were willing to go up to the highest floors of this, as high as they could get in this building, not knowing that they had with no water with them, not knowing that they had enough air to get back
clean air, knowing they weren't going to get there. You know, you see and you hear the Andy Rowe conversation in your book about, look, this is outside procedure, guys and girls. This is just get it done now.
We do what we can, and they didn't know that the building was structurally stable either. They could have collapsed around them for all they knew, and yet they were going back in, and they were trying, and you know, maybe making some mistakes here and there because it's an incident which will involve that, but not the bravery it takes to do that is something which I can only imagine, right? And it's all of the blue light responders are people for whom that is what they do.
There will always be an aspect of bravery, but with all due respect, there shouldn't need to be these high levels of heroicism because we should not be setting people up to fail. And that's what I think. I think what the one of the lawyers to the inquiry said was that the people at Grenfell Tower, and to be honest, the firefighters as well, it's unfair to ask firefighters to act as heroes in circumstances like that. And it cost them an awful lot. I mean, it could easily have cost them their lives. It certainly cost people the huge mental trauma that they faced. What people need, what the firefighters need, and what the residents who rely on the firefighters need is a structured professional plan to deal with an out-of-control fire in a building. And then to go and execute that, not to have to be a hero and make it up when they get there. And I think that, look, this isn't about throwing rocks. It's about coming together and bringing, because for me, firefighters, especially the frontline firefighters who respond to incidents, are the first victims of a building safety failure. You know, that if we don't get building regulations right, if we don't get fire safety rules right, the people who suffer from that are people who live in the buildings and firefighters, because they are the ones that are going to have to fix that unsolvable problem and fight that unsolvable fire that could have been fixed 20 years previously if people in roles so much more senior had simply done their job. And the problem that I would really emphasize is, okay, yeah, we're looking at cladding and we're looking at exactly what happened at Grenfell and trying to prevent it, but we are still making the same mistakes in terms of the built environment. We're still building buildings where this sort of disaster could happen, and we're still not taking on board the warnings and the people in the end who will be asked to do the impossible and then maybe blamed if it doesn't go wrong are the firefighters. So I think it's in the interest of everyone who's going to have to step into one of those burning buildings or live in it, that those people are held to account and made to do their jobs properly. Brother, I've absolutely loved that, mate. Thank you so much for your time. There's responsibility to be picked up off this plate by everybody, and I can only speak for myself and members of the LFB that I've worked with in the past. They are picking up those aspects of responsibility. We are learning. It's not all about finger pointing, but everybody needs to be picking up part of this responsibility. And I love the work that you're doing is pushing the focus onto those that are perhaps reticent to pick up their aspect of responsibility. So thanks so much for your time, brother. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Pete. Enjoyed the chat.
The Firefighters Podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, towels, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders. And please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening. And wherever you're in the world, please support your emergency services responders. And thank you for listening.